In this tutorial, we're going to discuss measuring economic activity. If our goal is to understand how much activity is happening in an economy, we might want to measure the output of that economy. We might want to measure expenditures in that economy, and we might want to measure the income. As it turns out, all of these measure the same thing. Our most common measure of economic activity is gross domestic product. There are other measures, but this is our baseline. And what gross domestic product is the market value of all final goods and services produced in a year within a country's borders. And it's important to look at each part of this definition. The market value suggests that the economic activity we are measuring, this is associated with goods and services that have market prices. So it's not going to include anything that's produced at home or anything that is perhaps produced under the table or in the underground economy. Final goods and services, we only count the last transaction. So these are all finished goods. Produced in a year, we have to define a time period over which we're measuring economic activity. Most commonly, we talk about a year. GDP is often measured quarterly, but it's annualized as if it were measured over an entire year. And within a country's borders, this is also important. We don't care when we measure economic activity using gross domestic product who owns the factories or where the firm is headquartered that's producing the goods within our country's borders. As long as that activity happens in the country, it's part of GDP. Again, there are other measures that may adjust for that, but this is our baseline and our most common measure of economic activity. One way to measure GDP is to measure expenditures. RC is our consumption expenditures. This is spending by households. This is us. This is the purchase of final goods and services by households for consumption. Now, firms also spend, and we call firm spending investment expenditures. Careful, macroeconomists, when we talk about investments, we're talking about machines, equipment, structures, software, and inventory purchases made by firms. Now, these aren't the only spenders in our economy, though they make up the bulk of expenditures. Our government also purchases goods and services. Our government purchases goods and services like defense expenditures, roads, schools, bridges, those sorts of things. Now, this is the spending of our household sector, our firm sector, and our government sector within the economy. However, some of the things that we consume have been produced elsewhere. So we're going to need to subtract that off. And some of the things that we produce in our economy are consumed by foreigners, so we need to add that back in. That's why we add net exports. So we're going to add in the exports, the things that foreigners purchase that were produced here, and we're going to subtract off imports. These are the things that we consume or invest or our government purchases that were consumed here but produced elsewhere. Once we do that, we add all these things up, we get our value for GDP. Now, alternatively, we could think about GDP as output, and we could measure the value of all goods and services produced in each sector of the economy, the agricultural sector, the mining sector, the service sector, and we could add up the value of all of that output of final goods and services. We end up getting the same thing. We also might want to think about GDP as a measure of income. We produce output using resources, land, labor, and capital. These resources earn income. We pay our labor wages. We pay our capital interest and gross profits, profits before taxes and depreciation, and we pay our land rent. Now, as one entity's expenditures end up being another entity's income that gets distributed across these three resources, if we add up wages, interest and profits, and rent, we're going to come up again with GDP. So the punchline here is GDP is the market value of all final goods and services produced in a year within a country, that's equal to expenditure is equal to income is equal to output. And it is our most common and probably most useful measure of economic activity.